Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, 22nd of March. Happy Equinox. I'm just getting ready to record The Outsiders and First Dog on the Moon, which as usual will be in separate broadcasts.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. Thank you, Barry. Panting up the stairs there because the lift is out. Today, we are joined by Lauren Rosewarne. She's a political scientist at Melbourne University, a writer and social researcher. Sinclair Davidson is in too, from the School of Economics at RMIT University, and Jack Waterford, editor-at-large of the Canberra Times. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Let's begin this morning with Malcolm Fraser.
And my questions to the Prime Minister.
No,
Yesterday,
that's
the
not
Prime Minister.
We'll come to that later, but Jack, we were going to play some Malcolm Fraser there, and it would have been lovely, but we won't. But the legacy was running hot in the weekend media. When Whitlam died, we reflected on the modern ALP somewhat unflatteringly. How might we reflect on the modern Liberal Party in the light of Fraser's career, do you think?
Well, perhaps one of the triumphs of Malcolm Fraser that people haven't thought about much was that the Labor Party shifted very ideologically to the right in the period after Fraser. And the ground that Fraser had occupied became, if you like, the centre, but largely Labor territory. As Labor shifted to the right, so did the Liberal Party, and eventually the Liberal Party umbrella didn't embrace people like Fraser. Fraser was not a one-off individual. He represented what in some ways you'd call these days the doctor's wives, people of sort of fundamentally decent, tolerant values, broadly middle of the road on most economic things, benevolent views about the roles and functions of government, with a slight disinclination to get too involved.
Which left him somewhat isolated. Sinclair, did Australian liberalism have to make that transition? Did it have to shift its ideological core?
Well, I think Jack's quite right. The entire debate in Australia shifted to the right. But at the same time, the kind of things which Fraser talked about and spoke about, open borders, immigration, having a more sensible approach on refugees, is not inconsistent with a lot of Liberal values. I mean, one of the things that's really what surprised me is how the Liberal Party have adopted what were Labor Party policies on mandatory detention with such gusto. That's very surprising, and it's not inconsistent with liberalism. It's just I think Mr. Fraser was a bit more outspoken in his criticism.
Lauren, I suspect you came to Fraser post-1975 because you were a young person.
Yes, I was born in 1980, a little bit after.
Which deprives you of that sense of his transition. How does he strike you then as a figure? I mean, he must that contrast is perhaps something that you don't have in your recollection of him.
I've been thinking a lot about it in the context of Carter in the US, in that context of how a leader has been rebranded after their leadership and how sort of works afterwards has shaped them in the imaginary for people who weren't exposed to the time, I guess, that was so pivotal for their career. So that idea of, say, Jimmy Carter with all the Habitat for Humanity, young people sort of have embraced him, quite distanced from his political role. And I think that's the same to an extent with Fraser, where unless I listen to my parents who were very involved in the Whitlam time, I guess I don't have that same connection to him as a politician so much as in the human rights area, quite separate.
Which Jack was of fundamental importance to Fraser all through his career, of course.
Well, yes, it was, particularly with racism, but a lot of things. I mean, Fraser was not particularly seen as progressive on Aboriginal affairs until he was had been actively Prime Minister for 2 or 3 years, and then it became obvious that his views had transformed. I actually witnessed some of this. I was in Alice Springs at the time, and I saw Fraser for the first time see Aboriginal living conditions out in traditional communities. And he was shocked. He had no idea. He had always had vaguely paternal and benevolent feelings about Aborigines, but he did not know not only how badly the situation was, but how ineffectually the government and public servants and missionaries and people were in dealing with it. And I think that became a major issue for him. The other thing that always thinks that humanised Fraser fairly early, and that was always very difficult, was his daughter Phoebe campaigning on Wales for him. Now, Phoebe later led him into care as well, which was one of the other aspects of his ultimate rehabilitation, I think.
Care, the charity, not the lifestyle choice.
Yes. Yes.
See, Claire, the point you made earlier about the shift in Australian politics, the great gravity which has taken it, and I think this is obviously observable to the right. What lies behind that? What's the...
Well, I think the realisation of what Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement had sort of not worked out as well as people had hoped. And I always think of Fraser as being sort of the last of the old-style Australian prime ministers, which we had just before we got the Great Reform era of the Hawke government. But to his credit, he was the guy who set up the Campbell Committee. He sort of laid some of the groundwork, but just never ever took that final step because to some extent he was the old-style Tory paternalist with sort of vague ideas that we should do the right thing by the plebs. So he couldn't take that next step. But I think but at the end of his prime ministership, I mean, if you remember, the 1970s were a terrible decade of stagflation and economic decline. There was the realization that something had to be done, and the Hawke government did something very radical. So Australia is vastly transformed now than what it was, and the kind of arguments that excite us are somewhat slightly different to what would have excited us then, and so a different aspect of Fraser's persona has come to the fore.
Does it say something, Lauren Rosewarne, about the modern Australian left? That one of the key figures is this old Tory patrician.
It certainly does, and it certainly reignites all those debates about where is the Labor Party trying to position itself now, and is there a Labor Party that taps into those Australians who are socially progressive and not so, I guess, swayed by economic issues, which is exactly the sort of, we've seen elections for the past couple of decades being targeted around economic and hip pocket values. Where is the party that represents those people who are interested in socially progressive issues as well? And that sort of shift of everyone's trying to catch the same pool of people has resulted in both parties losing a little of their heartland. The Labor Party probably more so.
Well, yes, a mass there with no obvious place to align themselves. But, well, economics and budgets and so forth are occupying our attention in the here and now. And Sinclair, you smile knowingly. A proposition for you, though, and this was the thing of this week, 16% of GDP is net debt is apparently a debt and deficit crisis, whereas 60% is a manageable sum. Can you reconcile those two ideas for us?
No, not at all. I'm kind of hoping that Abbott misspoke and saying things are not as bad as they could have been, but certainly I think saying that 60% of debt to GDP is a good number that we should be pleased about is certainly not the kind of thing that I expect to hear from almost any Australian Prime Minister. I think if we think back to the last election, it's bipartisan policy to balance the budget and get debt down, not to be bragging about how 60% is okay.
And yet, Jack Waterford, the spectacle of a Prime Minister saying that basically 40 years of deficits getting to as close as 1% in 2020 is okay, that is a rarity in Australian politics.
It's absolutely amazing. I must say, I start completely different from Sinclair in the sense that I do think that 50 or 60% is not unmanageable, though it has to be managed. And I've never thought that there was a sort of a crisis or an emergency about our fiscal situation.
Money is cheap.
I mean, that's in that sense that, well, it is particularly at the moment. But Abbott's whole political career, you might even say from DLP days, has been focused on the idea of emergency, crisis, 1 minute to midnight, glass half empty. And I don't think that he can just throw the switch to that and still have, a viable political future in that direction. I think he's got to rediscover himself fairly quickly.
Are you convinced by that, Lauren? The sense of crisis, the sense that we are now relaxed, that we will have a budget in what's less than 2 months now of no surprises, of a completely smug and happy situation. Are you?
I'm convinced that there's an ongoing need to create crises, particularly for a political agenda that has been driven by, you've got a party who came in with this idea that we had a budget crisis. I think there's this balancing act that you have to see the party tread, the Liberal Party tread, in terms of saying, on one hand, don't panic, things aren't that bad, but on the other hand, but we're still the right party because things could get worse at any time and we're the only ones who can keep the boat stable.
It's Jack Waterford. You know, we are not that far. We still have this extraordinary spectacle of significant bits of last budget still unlegislated and planning underway for the next one. Is that without precedent?
I can't remember a time when it was ever like this. The budget, of course, is less important in terms of the government's whole finances these days than it used to be, but it's still very important as a presentational platform for the government to say, you know, where they are, where they're going, what they intend to do, and so forth. And this is the area in which the government looks under great disarray. The other point I might make about a sense of crisis and emergency is the idea that this is a justification, if you like, for distorted priorities, some dubious, decision making and methods, and sometimes for some unexpected surprises and shortcuts. Now, Abbott has always had a tendency to get away with that by claiming the nature of the emergency. If, in fact, relax, it's all going to be dull and boring and so forth, there will be a lot more focus on his actual style and a lot more questions about his fundamental character, about his reflexes, and whether he's the sort of person, a bit like John Howard, that you instinctively trust to respond the right way to a crisis.
Annabelle Crabb's good on that today in her column. She reflects on that broad situation and then can't get the onion out of her head. She's listening to all these wise words from the Prime Minister, but they're thinking, but you ate an onion.
Including the skin.
It would be. But see, Claire, what should be the plan from here?
I think we need to have a sense of gravitas and a sense of, well, they came to power saying the adults were going to be in charge. Well, we actually do need to have those very adults step up and have that sense of gravitas. And this is something that I think has been lacking. The last budget was almost incoherent with some of those dreadful education reforms, which I just couldn't see what the purpose was. That ghastly medical aid fund. These were things that sort of surprised people and didn't fit into the whole narrative of debt and deficit. So we need somebody to take a deep breath, set out a path, explain to people carefully what's happening, and then appear as if they can make it happen, which we haven't actually had for a while.
Very quickly, Lauren, what would adults do right now?
What would adults do? Adults would, speak to us in a way that has that sense of calm as opposed to chaos. And I think that we're having this problem with whenever Tony Abbott opens his mouth, it seems like there's a chaos of nonsense coming out. There's a lot of garbled sentences, and I'm not sure whether that's speaking to the people in their own words. If that's the case, I don't speak that way, and I don't know who he's talking to.
We need calm, and who knows, we may receive that as we head to the last sitting week before the budget recess.
Okay, they're about to sign out. I will stop this and commence the new movie for First Dog on the Moon.